The first chapter in our 8-part chronicle of Anor Londo begins not at its gates, but within the conceptual blueprint of the divine mind. This is the narrative architectural supremacy, where the physical architecture of the world, the impossible spires and golden buttresses of the city of the gods, serves as a visual manifestation of absolute order. Within the eternal sunset and the echoing marble voids, the world witnessed the theological separation of space. The lore of this era is the lore of the celestial threshold. Its purpose was the geographic validation of godhood. The history of Anor Londo is the history of the Great Divide, where the Lords of Cinder elevated their home above the cloud line to insulate the divine from the mortal. This is the tragedy of the Gilded Cage, proving that sovereignty is a wall that excludes the subject to preserve the icon. The lore of the Age of Fire and the geometry of the Lordship provides the biological and spiritual foundation for this chapter's grandeur. Following the defeat of the dragons, the Lord Gwyn commissioned a city that would mirror the stability of the first flame, representing the immutability of the solar law. The lore suggests that Anor Londo is the skeleton of the pantheon. Its purpose was the materialization of the social hierarchy. By building on the high peaks of Lordran, the gods proved that proximity to the sun is equivalent to moral authority, showing that height is a measure of purity. This reveals the axiomatic purpose of the foundation. The gods ensured that the world would look up to find its meaning. This was the era of the sunlight spear. This shows that the history of the city is a history of the ascent, which grinds the landscape into a pedestal. The physical environment of the outer walls and the rotating elevator provides insight into the kinetic restriction of the fall. This is a labyrinth of marble guarded by sentinel giants, representing the interdiction of the uninvited. The lore of the Great Elevator explains that its purpose was the mechanical control of access. By designing a city that requires divine clearance to navigate, the lords proved that motion is a privilege granted by the crown, showing that space is a weapon. This reveals the administrative purpose of the exterior. The city is not a metropolis, it is a vault built to isolate the crown from the contagion of the undead. This was the era of the giant's halberd. This shows that the history of the wall is a history of the exclusion, which freezes the city in a post-human vacuum. The relationship between the painting guardians and the defense of the secret represents the fanatical custodianship within the fall. White-robed monastics patrol the rafters of the great cathedral, representing the protection of the anomalous realities hidden within the canvas. The lore suggests that the guardians are the silent wills of the cathedral. Their purpose was the spiritual shielding of the Ariamus canvas. By dancing along the ledges with curved swords, the guardians proved that the gods value secrets over citizens, showing that the parish exists only to house the exiled. This reveals the sensorial purpose of the climb. The gods do not trust the truth, they paint over the void to keep the subject docile. This was the era of the painting guardian sword. The history of the rafters is the history of the tightrope, which balances the city on the edge of madness. Furthermore, the lore of the sentinel giants and the automated majesty represents the impersonal enforcement within the fall. These armor-clad titans stand immobile until provoked, representing the end of human diplomacy in the City of Light. The lore suggests that the sentinels are the static force of the Lord. Its purpose was the dehumanization of the border guard. By placing inorganic beings to watch the doors, the gods proved that the city was already empty of life before the chosen ever arrived. This reveals the theatrical purpose of the guard. The gods maintained the illusion of order through the posture of iron. This was the era of the giant's shield. The relationship between the brass armor and the Lady of the Darkling represents the concealed identity within the fall. The firekeeper of Anor Londo hides her scars and flesh beneath bronze plating, representing the shame of those who serve the fading light. The lore suggests that the darkling is the internalized contradiction of the sun. Its purpose was the maintenance of the local bonfire. This reveals the hidden purpose of the armor. The gods require the broken to project the whole. This was the era of the Dark Moon Blade. This shows that the history of the Keeper is a history of the mask, which turns a goddess into a monument. The lore of the first spires and the reach of the sun represents the solar obsession within the narrative. The undead gazes at the gold reflected on the marble, proving that the visual weight of the gods is intended to overpower the will. The lore suggests that sunlight is a psychological binding. Its purpose was the anchoring of the mortal soul to the divine narrative. By bathing the city in false radiance, the gods confirmed that light is truth to those who fear the dark. This reveals the narcissistic purpose of the design. The lords built a mirror of the sky to avoid the mirror of the soul. The act concludes with the silent observation of the arrival at the main gate, realizing that the architecture is not a shelter, but a statement. The purpose of the Anor Londo Foundation lore was to be the universal exposure of the futility of the divine isolation. It shows that walls create the darkness they attempt to defeat. The player realizes that Anor Londo is a crown built for a head that has already fallen. The rise of the climber is the final movement of the Foundation lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, divinity is not a state of being, it is a scale of masonry that exhausts the earth to satisfy the ego. The legacy of the Foundation in this chapter is the horror of the architectural supremacy. We realize that grandeur was a bloody mask and light was a tether that the lords used to anchor the world to the reality of their own immortality. The purpose of the workshop of the sun was to inventory the pride, and the fall was the approach of the cursed. As the sun bleeds onto the gold, and the undead looks up at the spires, hearing the rattle of the elevator echoing through the clouds, they understand that the history of Anor Londo is the history of the wall, a wall that protects the gods but leaves the world to wither in the shadow of the dawn. The second chapter in our 8-part chronicle of Anor Londo documents the martial stagnation of the divine military. This is the narrative residual duty, where the physical architecture of the city, the exposed buttresses and narrow ledges, serves as the testing ground for those who attempt to breach the inner sanctum. Within the cold shadows of the marble walkways and the whistling wind of the high altitudes, the world witnessed the automation of loyalty. The lore of this era is the lore of the frozen garrison. Its purpose was the physical enforcement of the divine distance. The history of the Silver Knights is the history of the Hollowed Watch, where the former elite of Gwyn's army wait in eternal stillness for an enemy that has already won. This is the tragedy of the infinite posture, proving that service is a chain that binds the soldier to a grave disguised as a post. The lore of the Silver Knights and the preservation of the image provides the biological and spiritual foundation for this chapter's defense. Unlike the Black Knights who wandered the world, the Silver Knights stayed to protect the illusion of a living city, representing the internalized denial of the lordship. The lore suggests that the Silver Knight is the icon of the unchanging order. Its purpose was the static maintenance of the city's dignity. By standing rigid in empty halls, these knights proved that structure is more important than life, showing that loyalty requires the cessation of the individual. This reveals the ornamental purpose of the order. The gods used the noble to decorate their decay. This was the era of the Silver Knight straight sword. This shows that the history of the guard is a history of the statue, which turns a man into a fossil of duty. The physical environment of the great cathedral ledges provides insight into the tactical cruelty of the fall. This is a geometric kill zone designed to exploit the physics of gravity, representing the gods' contempt for the agile. The lore of the Dragonslayer Great Bow explains that its purpose was the execution of the transgressor from afar. by firing spear-sized arrows at intruders balancing on buttresses. The knights proved that hospitality is dead in the heavens, showing that sanctuary is an ambush. This reveals the vertical purpose of the defense. The city uses its own height as a blade to cut the path of the undead. This was the era of the Dragonslayer arrow. This shows that the history of the ledge is a history of the attrition, which uses falling as a judgment. The relationship between the great bow and the memory of the dragons represents the irony of the weaponry within the fall. The tool, once used to bring down the immortal scales, is now used to hunt cursed men, representing the demotion of the divine war. The lore suggests that the great bow is the skepticism of the sky. Its purpose was the projection of the god's power across the void. By knocking the steel, the Silver Knights proved that the old fire can only defend itself through extreme force, showing that the lordship is terrified of the small. This reveals the insecure purpose of the snipers. The gods fear the touch of the mortal, so they kill them at the horizon. This was the era of the Hawkeye ring. The history of the archer is the history of the distance, which keeps the sacred from being exposed. Furthermore, the lore of the empty bedchambers and the domestic ghost represents the absence of the divine within the fall. Beyond the nights, the living quarters of the gods are filled with dust and shadow, representing the fleeing of the family. The lore suggests that the Silver Vigil is a guard for a void. Its purpose was the concealment of the abandonment. By patrolling empty rooms, the knights proved that the orders remain even when the commander is gone, showing that in Anor Londo, bureaucracy is stronger than presence. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the Watch. The soldiers protect the fact that they have been left behind. This was the era of the Silver Knight Shield. The relationship between the knight's prowess and the hollowed repetition represents the mechanical reflex within the fall. The Silver Knights fight with flawless technique but zero intent, representing the muscle memory of a dead spirit. The lore suggests that the vigil is a ritual of the sword. Its purpose was the demonstration of the superiority of the divine training. This reveals the exhaustive purpose of the combat. The undead learns that skill without will is a clockwork executioner. This was the era of the parry and riposte. This shows that the history of the vigil is a history of the echo, which mimics the war to hide the silence. The lore of the mimics of the treasure hall represents the cynical distrust within the narrative. Among the chests of divine relics are monsters that prey on the greedy, proving that even in the capital, safety is a deception. The lore suggests that the mimic is the final filter of the vigil. Its purpose was the punishment of the unworthy seeker. By disguising death as reward, the knights, or their masters, confirmed that Anor Londo does not gifts, it entraps. This reveals the predatory purpose of the vault. The gods turn the hope of the pilgrim into a mouth. The act concludes with the silent observation of the Great Hall gates, realizing that the knights were only the introduction to the true horror of the palace. The purpose of the Silver Vigil lore was to be the universal exposure of the futility of the loyal guard. It shows that duty is a grave. The player realizes that Lord Ran is a clock that ticks because the springs do not know they are broken. The rise of the Nightslayer is the final movement of the Vigil lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, service is not a virtue, it is a stagnation that exhausts the identity to satisfy the architecture. The legacy of the Vigil in this chapter is the horror of the martial stagnation. We realize that honor was a bloody anchor and order was a tether that the Silver Knights used to anchor the city to the reality of its own irrelevance. The purpose of the workshop of the shield was to inventory the obedience, and the fall was the silence of the blade. As the great arrow whistles and the undead hides behind the pillar, hearing the clank of the armor echoing through the hall. They understand that the history of the vigil is the history of the ghost, a ghost that holds the line but leaves the world to burn in the cold of the divine neglect. The third chapter in our 8-part chronicle of Anor Londo documents the biological polarization of the city's final defense. This is the narrative sacrificial jurisprudence, where the physical architecture of the world, the great hall of the giants, and the stained glass spires, serves as the arena of the ultimate civ. Within the dust-choked beams of light and the shattered pillars of the cathedral, the world witnessed the theological trial of the successor. The lore of this era is the lore of the twin sentinels. Its purpose was the surgical extraction of the undead's potential. The history of Ornstein and Smuff is the history of the asymmetric guard, where the grace of the dragon slayer and the depravity of the executioner combine to form a closed loop of lethality. This is the tragedy of the necessary monster, proving that divinity is a force that employs the sacred and the profane to protect the void. The lore of Dragon Slayer Ornstein and the Golden Nobility provides the spiritual foundation for this chapter's intensity. As the captain of the 4 Knights of Gwyn, Ornstein remained at his post while his peers fled or fell, representing the refusal of the divine to relinquish the throne. The lore suggests that Ornstein is the icon of the unwavering sun. Its purpose was the demonstration of the god's martial perfection. By wielding the lightning that once sundered dragon scales, Ornstein proved that the old order is still capable of thunder, showing that dignity is an armor that defies the age. This reveals the heroic purpose of the guard. The gods left a legend to validate the sacrifice. This was the era of the Leo ring. This shows that the history of the lion is a history of the residue, which turns a knight into a relic of lightning. The physical environment of the Great Hall of the cathedral provides insight into the spatial intimidation of the fall. This is a non-human scale designed to make the undead feel their insignificance, representing the distance between the mortal and the divine. The lore of Executioner Smuff explains that its purpose was the implementation of domestic brutality. Though a giant of immense power, Smuff was denied knightly status because he ground the bones of his victims into his feed, proving that the gods value function over morality. This reveals the vicious purpose of the Sentinel. The city uses a cannibal to clean the floor of the heavens. This was the era of the Smuff's great hammer. This shows that the history of the executioner is a history of the appetite, which uses cruelty as a fortification. The relationship between the absorbed soul and the transformation of power represents the metabolic opportunism within the fall. When one guardian falls, the other consumes or honors their essence to grow in scale, representing the consolidation of the divine shard. The lore suggests that the superform is the true verdict. Its purpose was the final evaluation of the chosen undead's adaptability. By integrating the lightning or the size, the guardians proved that the lordship requires the total absorption of the other, showing that in Anor Londo, survival is cannibalistic. This reveals the predatory purpose of the encounter. The gods teach the subject that power must be stolen from the fallen. This was the era of the core soul. The history of the phase is the history of the synthesis, which prepares the undead for the flame. Furthermore, the lore of the statues of the Great Hall and the erased identity represents the censorship of the bloodline within the fall. Flanking the arena are the statues of Gwyn, Gwynevere, and an empty plinth where the firstborn once stood, representing the surgical removal of the rebel from the narrative. The lore suggests that the Great Hall is a memory hole. Its purpose was the enforcement of the family myth. By removing the god of war, the gods proved that existence is subject to divine approval, showing that in Anor Londo, truth is sculpted to suit the crown. This reveals the revisionist purpose of the arena. The undead fights in a gallery of lies. This was the era of the sunlight blade. The relationship between the Leo ring and the hidden cowardice represents the doubt of the paragon within the fall. Though Ornstein is the captain, his ring suggests he was the first to falter or leave, according to later histories, representing the fragility of the divine spirit. The lore suggests that the captain is a posthumous projection. Its purpose was the maintenance of the morale of the undead. This reveals the deceptive purpose of the guard. The gods projected a legend to hide the fact that the real Ornstein had already sought his old master. This was the era of the old lion. This shows that the history of the captain is a history of the mirage, which uses glory to hide the departure. The lore of the sunlight metal and the logic of praise represents the ritualistic compliance within the narrative. The undead finds the metals of the sun in the chest of the Great Hall, proving that faith is a currency produced by the city. The lore suggests that the metal is the token of the compliant soul. Its purpose was the standardization of the divine favor. By rewarding cooperation under the sun, the gods confirmed that Anor Londo does not value strength, it values symmetry. This reveals the standardized purpose of the hall. The gods turned the warrior into a collector of sunlight. The act concludes with the silent observation of the lifting of the elevator to the chamber of the princess, realizing that the executioners were only the hardware for the final software of the city's will. The purpose of the divine executioner lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the trial. It shows that paradise demands blood to open. The player realizes that Lord Ran is a mechanism that weighs the soul against the steel. The rise of the Slayer of Gods is the final movement of the executioner lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, success is not a reward, it is a transformation that exhausts the mercy of the subject to satisfy the throne. The legacy of the executioners in this chapter is the horror of the biological polarization. We realize that nobility was a bloody tool and order was a tether that Smuff used to anchor the undead to the reality of their own brutality. The purpose of the workshop of the hammer was to crush the ego, and the fall was the opening of the chamber. As the lightning fades and the undead steps over the gold armor, hearing the echo of the princess echoing through the walls, they understand that the history of the hall is the history of the grind, a grind that crushes the weak but temples the strong to maintain the shadow of the divine gaze. The fourth chapter in our 8-part chronicle of Anor Londo records the ontological gaslighting of the pilgrim. This is the narrative spectacular deception, where the physical architecture of the world, the chamber of the princess, and the infinite sunlight streaming through the windows represents the desperate projection of a fading dynasty. Within the blinding radiance of the golden bedchamber and the melodic silence of the royal quarters, the world witnessed the mechanical staging of divinity. The lore of this era is the lore of the golden mirage. Its purpose was the psychological anchoring of the chosen undead. The history of Gwynevere is the history of the fled goddess, where the image of the daughter of sunlight is maintained as a psychic wall against the truth of the dark. This is the tragedy of the beautiful void, proving that hope is a painting that dissolves the moment the observer strikes the canvas. The lore of Gwynevere, Princess of Sunlight, and the motherly archetype provides the emotional foundation for this chapter's manipulation. Known as the giver of life and the symbol of fertility, her enormous form radiates a warmth that calms the violent spirit, representing the divine reward for the challenger. The lore suggests that the princess is the icon of the justified sacrifice. Its purpose was the moral validation of the linking of the fire. By appearing to the undead with open arms, the image proved that the gods are still present and grateful, showing that suffering is not in vain. This reveals the sedative purpose of the chamber. The lords created a mother to soothe the slave. This was the era of the Sun Princess ring. This shows that the history of the daughter is a history of the exit, which leaves a memory to guard the door. The physical environment of the chamber of the princess provides insight into the theatrical perfection of the fall. This is a sacred sanctuary designed to overpower the senses with awe, representing the purity of the divine family. The lore of the divine blessing explains that its purpose was the commodification of grace. By offering water that heals all ailments, the image proved that divinity is infinite in its mercy, showing that the sun is the source of life. This reveals the manipulative purpose of the presence. The city uses comfort to blind the soldier to the rot under the floorboards. This was the era of the flowing gown. This shows that the history of the chamber is a history of the stage, which uses beauty as a blinder. The relationship between the Lord Vessel and the contract of the sun represents the legalistic entrapment within the fall. Gwynevere bestows the golden bowl upon the undead, representing the official delegation of the divine will. The lore suggests that the Lord Vessel is the key to the cage. Its purpose was the integration of the subject into the sacrificial system. By granting the ability to warp between bonfires, the princess proved that the chosen has become an extension of the fire, showing that in Anor Londo, power is a tether. This reveals the transactional purpose of the gift. The gods give the undead wings so they can fly into the furnace. This was the era of the golden warp. The history of the vessel is the history of the lease, which turns the warrior into a courier of ash. Furthermore, the lore of the hidden exit and the real flan represents the cowardly abandonment within the fall. Beneath the story of the princess lies the truth that Gwynevere married the flame god Flan and fled the city centuries ago, representing the dissolution of the royal household. The lore suggests that the presence in the chamber is a hologram of grief. Its purpose was the concealment of the divine flight. By maintaining the fictive princess, the remnant proved that authority cannot survive the exposure of its absence, showing that in Anor Londo, order is maintained through pretense. This reveals the cowardly purpose of the illusion. The gods ran away, but they left the lights on to fool the thieves. The relationship between the strike of the arrow and the shattering of the sun represents the fragility of the lie within the fall. A single point of damage to the princess causes the golden sky to collapse into night, representing the instantaneous death of the divine narrative. The lore suggests that the shattering is the final awakening. Its purpose was the reveal of the city's true state. This reveals the ephemeral purpose of the illusion. The god's world is a veneer of light stretched over a void of dark. This was the era of the darkened Anor Londo. This shows that the history of the sun is a history of the mask, which crumbles under the weight of a question. The lore of the dark moon blade and the retribution of the shadow represents the punitive mechanism within the narrative. When the illusion breaks, the blades of the dark moon are summoned to hunt the sinner, proving that the gods protect their lies with steel. The lore suggests that the dark moon is the police of the myth. Its purpose was the suppression of the truth seeker. By invading the world of the guilty, the remnant confirmed that Anor Londo does not forgive clarity. This reveals the vengeful purpose of the dark. The gods kill the man who sees the shadow. The act concludes with the silent observation of the princess's dissolution into blue sparks. Realizing that the warmth was artificial and the giver of life was dead air. The purpose of the illusion lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the deception. It shows that paradise requires blindness to exist. The player realizes that Lord Ran is a corpse painted with gold. The rise of the eye-opener is the final movement of the illusion lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, truth is not a reward, it is a curse that exposes the sacrifice to the absolute silence of the gods. The legacy of the princess in this chapter is the horror of the ontological gaslighting. We realize that mercy was a bloody program and light was a tether that Gwyndolin used to anchor the undead to the reality of their own delusion. The purpose of the workshop of the sun was to fabricate the future, and the fall was the death of the image. As the sun fails and the undead stands in the dark moonlight, hearing the scream of the spirit echoing through the empty palace, they understand that the history of the chamber is the history of the lie, a lie that feeds the soul to maintain the hunger of the flame. The fifth chapter in our 8-part chronicle of Anor Londo unmasks the shadow sovereignty operating beneath the golden veneer. This is the narrative androgynous isolation, where the physical architecture of the world, the hidden corridor behind the statue of Gwyn, and the infinite hallway of the dark moon tomb, represents the repressed reality of the divine lineage. Within the stagnant moonlight and the soft rustle of silken robes, the world witnessed the secret governance of the fading. The lore of this era is the lore of the unwanted heir. Its purpose was the sustenance of a kingdom through invisible will. The history of Gwyndolin is the history of the divine anomaly, where the sun is managed by the moon to prevent the collapse of civilization. This is the tragedy of the duty-bound exile, proving that order is a masquerade that requires the sacrifice of the identity to keep the lie alive. The lore of dark Sun Gwyndolin and the fragility of the Lunar Lord provides the biological and psychological foundation for this chapter's subversion. Born with an affinity for the moon and serpentine legs, Gwyndolin was raised as a daughter due to his frailty and ugly mutations, representing the shame of the Sunlight dynasty. The lore suggests that Gwyndolin is the icon of the diligent shadow. Its purpose was the tactical management of the Age of Fire's twilight. By staying in the tomb while his siblings fled, Gwyndolin proved that power can be exercised through absence, showing that authority is a projection of will. This reveals the rejectionist purpose of the moon. The gods cast out the abnormal only for the abnormal to become the last guardian of the throne. This was the era of the dark moon bow. This shows that the history of the sun is a history of the mask, which turns a god into a ghost. The physical environment of the dark moon tomb provides insight into the funereal authority of the fall. This is a sacred basement designed to house the empty coffin of Gwyn, representing the center of the divine cult. The lore of the infinite hallway explains that its purpose was the geometric enforcement of the divine distance. By creating a space that never ends until the master allows it, Gwyndolin proved that reality is fluid in the presence of sorcery, showing that truth is a horizon you can never reach. This reveals the magical purpose of the tomb. The city hides its heart in a labyrinth of grief to prevent the theft of the fire. This was the era of the tin dark moon catalyst. This shows that the history of the tomb is a history of the mourning, which uses space as a shroud. The relationship between the blades of the dark moon and the judicial phantom represents the extraterritorial policing within the fall. Gwyndolin commands a covenant of spirits who invade the worlds of those who sin against the gods, representing the long reach of the fated capital. The lore suggests that the blades are the enforcers of the divine status quo. Its purpose was the punishment of the transgressor across the multiverse. By hunting the indicted, Gwyndolin proved that the law of Anor Londo does not stop at the walls, showing that in Lordran, guilt is a beacon. This reveals the punitive purpose of the covenant. The gods used the shadow to maintain the light. This was the era of the blue-eye orb. The history of the blade is the history of the vengeance, which turns the victim into an assassin. Furthermore, the lore of the sun mask and the visual erasure represents the subjugated identity within the fall. Gwyndolin covers his face with a radiant mask that mimics the sun, representing his internalized failure to meet the standard of his father. The lore suggests that the mask is a symbol of the stolen legacy. Its purpose was the visual continuity of the Sun King's reign. By wearing the sun, the moon sun proved that image is more valuable than truth, showing that in Anor Londo, the gods would rather be icons than individuals. This reveals the erasure purpose of the regalia. The son deletes himself to become the father. This was the era of the moonlight arrows. The relationship between the serpentine legs and the primordial connection represents the ancient corruption within the fall. The snakes that carry Gwyndolin's torso connect him to the dragons and the deep, representing a mutation that blurs the lines between divinity and beast. The lore suggests that the snakes are the symptoms of the fading logic. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the divine decay. This reveals the biological purpose of the guardian. The gods are regressing into the primal as the flame dies. This was the era of the soul of Gwyndolin. This shows that the history of the body is a history of the hybrid, which exposes the instability of the lordship. The lore of the Dark Moon Seance Ring and the ritual entrance represents the spiritual invitation within the narrative. The undead must wear a signet to reveal the path to the master, proving that access to the shadow is granted only through compliance. The lore suggests that the ring is the key to the hidden conscience. Its purpose was the filtering of the worthy servant. By hiding the door behind magic, Gwyndolin confirmed that Anor Londo does not want observers. It wants believers. This reveals the ritualistic purpose of the descent. The gods require the subject to seek the dark to find the light. The act concludes with the silent observation of the duel in the Dark Moon tomb, realizing that the architect was a shattered child clinging to the memory of a throne that hated him. The purpose of the Dark Sun lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the repression. It shows that order is built on shame. The player realizes that Lord Ran is a family tragedy dressed in magic. The rise of the deicide is the final movement of the shadow lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, truth is not a rescue, it is a violation of a sacred privacy that exhausts the god to satisfy the void. The legacy of Gwyndolin in this chapter is the horror of the shadow sovereignty. We realize that duty was a bloody cage and magic was a tether that the moon used to anchor the city to the reality of its own extinction. The purpose of the workshop of the moon was to maintain the illusion, and the fall was the death of the director. As the moonlight fades and the undead stands over the robes of the prince, hearing the echo of the serpents echoing through the empty stone, they understand that the history of the tomb is the history of the lie, a lie that gilds the dark to hide the failure of the sun. The 6th chapter in our 8-part chronicle of Anor Londo shifts from the sacred halls to the secular madness of the city's intellectual annex. This is the narrative scientific blasphemy, where the physical architecture of the world, the infinite shelves of the Duke's archives, and the optical illusions of the crystal cave represents the metastasis of obsession. Within the frantic scratching of pens and the humming resonance of crystalline growth, the world witnessed the theological abandonment of reason. The lore of this era is the lore of the blind dragon's hubris. Its purpose was the systemic extraction of immortality through logic. The history of Seth is the history of the white betrayal, where a lord of the Age of Fire sacrificed the sanity of the kingdom to cure his own biological lack. This is the tragedy of the scaleless, proving that knowledge without ethics is a crystalline cancer that consumes the future to study the past. The lore of Seth the Scaleless and the resentment of the ancient provides the biological foundation for this chapter's corruption. Born without the stone scales of his kin, Seth betrayed the everlasting dragons to Gwyn, representing the origin of the lordship's power. The lore suggests that Seth is the icon of the insecure genius. Its purpose was the realization of a mortality-defying science. By researching the primordial crystal, Seth proved that immortality can be manufactured through theft, showing that existence is a formula to be solved. This reveals the jealous purpose of the archive. The Duke built a library to overcome the fact of his own fragility. This was the era of the Moonlight Greatsword. This shows that the history of the dragon is a history of the envy, which turns a liberator into a vivisectionist. The physical environment of the Duke's archives provides insight into the labyrinthine insanity of the fall. This is a vertical panopticon designed to trap the mind in infinite reference, representing the god's delegation of intellect to the mad. The lore of the channelers explains that its purpose was the remote surveillance of the flesh. These six-eyed sorcerers kidnapped maidens and undead for the Duke's experiments, proving that science requires a victim, showing that progress is a predator. This reveals the clinical purpose of the tower. The archive is not a school, it is a processing plant for the soul. This was the era of the channeler's trident. This shows that the history of the Duke is a history of the kidnapping, which uses inquiry as a noose. The relationship between the Pizzicas and the failure of mutation represents the biological remorse within the fall. Behind the prison cells lie screaming blue monsters that cower in the dark, representing the former maidens of the princess transformed by crystalline logic. The lore suggests that the Pizzicas are the symptoms of the Duke's failure. Its purpose was the demonstration of the irreversibility of the research. By crying when the music plays, these creatures proved that the soul cannot be erased, only deformed, showing that in Anor Londo, curiosity is mutilation. This reveals the pathetic purpose of the dungeon. The gods allowed the scream to be archived. This was the era of the soothing sunlight. The history of the cell is the history of the sob, which echoes through the science. Furthermore, the lore of the crystal soldiers and the loss of self represents the architectural infection within the fall. The guards of the archive have been overgrown by blue geodes that control their will, representing the totalitarian nature of the Duke's atmosphere. The lore suggests that the crystal soldier is the final result of the environment. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the stagnant knowledge. By shattering into dust upon death, these soldiers proved that the mind becomes the wall it inhabits, showing that in the archives, information hardens into a prison. This reveals the rigid purpose of the infestation. The knowledge kills the host. This was the era of the crystal straight sword. The relationship between the invisible paths and the blindness of the Duke represents the optical subjectivity within the fall. To reach the heart of the cave, the undead must walk on nothing, representing the fact that the Duke, who is blind, navigates through sound and faith in geometry. The lore suggests that the path is the trial of the unseen. Its purpose was the filtering of the perceptive soul. This reveals the ironic purpose of the cave. The dragon who sought to see everything ended up trapped in a world where light is an obstacle. This was the era of the blue titanite. This shows that the history of the cave is a history of the sensory deprivation, which turns reality into a guess. The lore of the primordial crystal and the externalized life represents the philosophical error within the narrative. Seth stored his soul in a fragment of magic outside his body, proving that immortality is a fragile object. The lore suggests that the crystal is the ego of the dragon. Its purpose was the decentralization of mortality. By hiding his life in a stone, Seth confirmed that divinity is a prop that can be broken, showing that the eternal requires a garrison. This reveals the vulnerable purpose of the crystal. The god is only as strong as his library. The act concludes with the silent observation of the shattering of the primordial crystal, realizing that the Duke was a clattering lizard driven to madness by the silence of the scales he never owned. The purpose of the archive lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the intellectual fall. It shows that logic is a poison when mixed with fear. The player realizes that Anor Londo is a brain that has turned on itself. The rise of the Cinder Seeker is the final movement of the archive lore. proving that in the world of Dark Souls, genius is not a solution, it is a mutation that exhausts the compassion to satisfy the formula. The legacy of the archives in this chapter is the horror of the scientific blasphemy. We realize that discovery was a bloody dissection and crystal was a tether that Seth used to anchor the city to the reality of his own insanity. The purpose of the workshop of the glass was to catalog the agony, and the fall was the shattering of the mind. As the flakes of magic fall like snow, and the undead stands over the dissolving dragon, hearing the scream of the Pizzicast echoing through the books, they understand that the history of the archive is the history of the eye, an eye that sees the atom but misses the world. The 7th chapter in our 8-part chronicle of Anor Londo documents the visual apocalypse of the divine capital. This is the narrative theological collapse, where the physical architecture of the world, the cold marble and star-choked sky of the darkened city, represents the dissolution of the great lie. Within the absolute stillness of the shadow-drenched plazas and the eerie glow of the moon over the cathedral, the world witnessed the end of the solar era. The lore of this era is the lore of the nocturnal truth. Its purpose was the surgical removal of the divine propaganda. The history of the darkened city is the history of the silent exile, where the gods are revealed to have vanished long ago, leaving only phantoms and vengeful spirits to pollute the air. This is the tragedy of the empty heaven, proving that light was a blindfold that prevented the subject from seeing the grave. The lore of the shattered sun and the realization of the void provides the philosophical foundation for this chapter's darkness. By striking the image of the princess, the chosen undead breaks the spiritual seal on the atmosphere, representing the courage to face the absence of God. The lore suggests that the dark sun is the true face of the age. Its purpose was the realization of the universe's indifference. By exposing the stars above the spires, the undead proved that the sun was only a curtain, showing that reality is quiet and cold. This reveals the unmasking purpose of the strike. The city does not burn, it sleeps in the abyss. This was the era of the darkened cathedral. This shows that the history of the light is a history of the distraction, which turns a funeral into a festival. The physical environment of the darkened Anor Londo provides insight into the atmospheric desolation of the fall. This is a ghost town designed to echo the sound of loneliness, representing the true condition of the divine kingdom. The lore of the Blade of the Dark Moon explains that its purpose was the retributive enforcement of the secret. As the sun fails, the moon sends its spirits to execute the blasphemer, proving that authority becomes more vicious when it is seen, showing that governance is an invasion. This reveals the punitive purpose of the night. The city kills the witness to save the myth. This was the era of the Blue Eye Orb. This shows that the history of the shadow is a history of the police, which uses darkness as a uniform. The relationship between Gwyndolin's confrontation and the final defense represents the pitiful desperation within the fall. The prince attacks from the end of a hallway that never stops, representing his refusal to let the mortal touch the tomb of the father. The lore suggests that the duel is the suicide of the illusionist. Its purpose was the desperate protection of the royal honor. By firing arrows of magic from the mist, Gwyndolin proved that the gods are cowards who fight from the background, showing that in Anor Londo, heroism is dead. This reveals the protective purpose of the encounter. The sun dies to defend an empty coffin. This was the era of the moonlight arrow. The history of the duel is the history of the last stand, which exposes the god as a frightened child. Furthermore, the lore of the disappearance of the sentinels and the reality of the guard represents the erasure of the artificial within the fall. When the sun goes out, the giant sentinels vanish like mist, representing the fact that they were only magic projections of the sunlight. The lore suggests that the guardians were holographic terror, Its purpose was the implementation of a victimless security. By removing the iron giants, the city proved that the undead was fighting nothing but light the entire time, showing that in Anor Londo, obstacles are imaginary. This reveals the deceptive purpose of the spires. The gods built a fortress of air. The relationship between the Darkling Firekeeper and the final loyalty represents the personal betrayal within the fall. The Lady of the First Bonfire attacks the Chosen for killing her master, Gwyndolin, representing the internalized bond of the cursed to the divine. The lore suggests that the Keeper is the Stockholm Syndrome of the age. Its purpose was the demonstration of the complexity of faith. This reveals the mournful purpose of the duel. The gods turned the victims of the dark sign into the bodyguards of their oppressors. This was the era of the brass armor. This shows that the history of the Keeper is a history of the complicity, which turns service into blindness. The lore of the stars and the primordial night represents the cosmic correction within the narrative. The undead walks through the plaza and sees the galaxy, proving that the universe is waiting for the flame to die. The lore suggests that the night is the natural state of the soul. Its purpose was the emotional preparation for the age of dark. By showing the beauty of the stars, the city confirmed that light is an interruption of the silence, showing that the void is not a hell, it is an end. This reveals the naturalistic purpose of the darkening. The world wants to sleep. The act concludes with the silent observation of the abandoned palace, realizing that the gargoyles are gone and the gold is gray. The purpose of the City of the Moon lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the disillusionment. It shows that sanctuary is an illusion maintained by fear. The player realizes that Lord Ran is a stage after the show. The rise of the Ghostwalker is the final movement of the night lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, clarity is not a gift, it is a shattering of the self to satisfy the abyss. The legacy of the moon in this chapter is the horror of the visual apocalypse. We realize that presence was a bloody lie and hope was a tether that Gwyndolin used to anchor the undead to the reality of their own blindness. The purpose of the workshop of the night was to measure the silence, and the fall was the death of the projection. As the moon shines and the undead stands in the empty chamber, hearing the echo of the wind echoing through the dead halls, they understand that the history of the moon is the history of the truth, a truth that kills the gods to maintain the honesty of the dark. The eighth and final chapter in our Chronicle of Anor Londo documents the temporal obsolescence of the divine seat. This is the narrative archaeological despair, where the physical architecture of the world, the weathered statues and dust-choked altars, represents the final decay of the lordship's influence. Within the whistling drafts of the empty cathedrals and the long shadows cast by the setting sun of an era, the world witnessed the metabolization of the divine by the mundane. The lore of this era is the lore of the cultural relic. Its purpose was the theological fossilization of the Age of Fire. The history of the legacy is the history of the echoing hall, where the city of the gods ceases to be a power and becomes a memory. This is the tragedy of the monument, proving that divinity is a moment that exhausts the future to gild the past. The lore of the fled royalty and the diaspora of the heavens provides the sociological foundation for this chapter's hollow ending. Long before the undead's arrival, the gods abandoned their capital to escape the dark, representing the cowardice of the immortal. The lore suggests that Anor Londo is the icon of the abandoned post. Its purpose was the demonstration of the irrelevance of the throne. By leaving the spires to the illusionist and the executioners, the gods proved that home is disposable, showing that authority is a ghost that haunts the stone. This reveals the hollow purpose of the palace. The city exists to house the weight of the absence. This was the era of the sunless realms. This shows that the history of the gods is a history of the flight, which turns empire into a museum. The physical environment of the post-climactic cathedral provides insight into the environmental entropy of the fall. This is a cold shell designed to withstand time, but not neglect, representing the arrogance of permanent design. The lore of the abandoned miracles explains that its purpose was the residual transmission of the divine will. By leaving spells like the bountiful sunlight in empty rooms, the gods proved that their power is inorganic, showing that grace is a script that runs without a coder. This reveals the mechanical purpose of the relics. The city functions because the spells do not know their masters are gone. This was the era of the Sun Princess's ring. This shows that the history of the relic is a history of the record, which uses faith as a recording. The relationship between the Lord Vessel and the transition of the world state represents the metabolic requirement within the fall. Once the vessel is filled with the Lord souls, the significance of Anor Londo dissolves, representing the movement of the cosmic center to the kiln. The lore suggests that the city is the womb of the sacrifice. Its purpose was the incubation of the successor. By providing the trial and the gift, the city proved that it was only a machine built to produce a fuel, showing that in Lordran, architecture is secondary to combustion. This reveals the instrumental purpose of the spires. The gods built a scale to measure the burnability of the soul. This was the era of the opening of the gate. Furthermore, the lore of the last gargoyle and the fatigue of the watch represents the biological exhaustion within the fall. The stone guardians attack with sluggish reflexes, representing the physical weariness of centuries of boredom. The lore suggests that the guardian is the pulse of the dead city. Its purpose was the maintenance of the perimeter against the unworthy. By dying at the hand of the undead, the gargoyles proved that the old defense is porous, showing that in Anor Londo, the armor is empty. This reveals the failing purpose of the security. The gods trusted stone to stop time. This was the era of the gargoyle's halberd. The relationship between the painting of Ariamis and the cycle of renewal represents the secret continuity within the fall. While Anor Londo rots, the painted world burns and is reborn, representing a parallel logic that defies the stagnation of the sun. The lore suggests that the painting is the critique of the capital. Its purpose was the preservation of the concept of the end. This reveals the redemptive purpose of the exile. The gods locked change in a frame, but change is the only thing that survives. This was the era of the peculiar doll. This shows that the history of the canvas is a history of the escape, which turns art into a lifeboat. The lore of the final sunset and the convergence of the ages represents the linear finality within the narrative. The undead leaves the city for the last time, proving that the sun will never rise again over the marble. The lore suggests that Anor Londo is the final horizon of the divine. Its purpose was the emotional closure of the cursed pilgrim. By beating the lords in their own home, the undead confirmed that godhood is a status that can be unseated, showing that the future belongs to the ash. This reveals the terminal purpose of the city. The sun sets so the man can walk. The act concludes with the silent observation of the undead gazing at the distant spires from the Firelink shrine, realizing that the gold was always sand. The purpose of the Anor Londo legacy lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the forgotten. It shows that grandeur is a symptom of fear. The player realizes that Lord Ran is a corpse that is finally cooling. The rise of the Lord Vesselbearer is the final movement of the Anor Londo lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, ascent is not a homecoming, it is a farewell to a father who died to keep the light from moving on. The legacy of the sun in this final chapter is the horror of the temporal obsolescence. We realize that eternity was a bloody tax and civilization was a tether that Gwyn used to anchor the world to the reality of his own ego. The purpose of the workshop of the sun was to inventory the end, and the fall was the silence of the cathedral. As the light dips below the mountains, and the undead turns their back on the gold, hearing the echo of the sentinels echoing through the void. They understand that the history of Anor Londo is the history of the sinking, a sinking that drowns the gods to maintain the stagnation of the flame.